As we all know, Kentucky is currently facing a health crisis due to the opioid epidemic. And one of the effects of the use of opiates during pregnancy, to be specific, is neonatal abstinence syndrome. Neonatal abstinence syndrome is a drug withdrawal syndrome that may result from chronic maternal opioid use during pregnancy. And it is a treatable condition seen in about 30 to 80% of infants born to women who used opiates during their pregnancy. So in my brochure, I kept it simple and to the point. So I discussed the effects of neonatal abstinence syndrome in prenatal, infancy, toddler age, and then school age and after as well. I also included how to comfort your infant and your baby when they are dealing with withdrawal syndromes, whether you're in the hospital or outside of the hospital. And then I also included additional resources on the back, which would allow for parents or caregivers to further educate themselves on how to comfort their baby dealing with the neonatal abstinence syndrome. One thing that I would like to point out is, unfortunately with a brochure, it's so hard to fit all of the information into the brochure itself because you don't want to overstimulate and overwhelm your reader. So that's one of the main reasons I kind of kept it simple and to the point, and then that way, they could get an idea of what neonatal syndrome is and how they can comfort and soothe their baby and what kind of effects to look forward to later in life. And that's also why I offered additional resources. So if they were, intrigued from the brochure, they could then go to these resources and further educate themselves. One of the resources is a video, and it shows different approaches for the parents or caregivers to use when dealing with these infants. And then another one is a link that I'll actually go into a little bit of detail later. So some main things that I wanted to point out from the research that I conducted is neonatal abstinence syndrome has actually increased by more than 400% in the past 2 decades. And with that, neonatal abstinence syndrome has a negative association with cognitive and motor outcomes, and they can start as early as 6 months of age and persist during school age as well, which is something that I think a lot of people don't realize because, when they're infants, they show signs of sweating and trembling and, irritability. And so with that, it's easier to comfort, to, soothe the baby. And then as they get older, they might not necessarily show those physical effects, but as far as like neurological and things like that, it does actually stay with them. So the opioid crisis, like I mentioned before, is very prevalent in Kentucky, but not only is it a public health emergency, it's also a national health emergency as well. Between 14 and 22% of women nationwide fill an opioid medication prescription during pregnancy. And in 2012, it was found that every 25 minutes on average, an infant was born with neonatal abstinence syndrome. And something I'd like to point out is that was in 2012. It's 2019 now, which is a 7-year difference. And, from what I've heard about the opioid crisis, I would say that 25 minutes has probably gotten shorter. So I would say it was, every 10 minutes, every 15, in my opinion, is what I believe. And then one of the things I kind of mentioned in my brochure but wasn't able to get into detail about is the eat, sleep, and console approach. I offered a quote by Matthew Grossman in the brochure that tells, parents and caregivers that this approach is successful. They've done a research study on it, and it actually decreased the amount of stay that the newborn had to be in the hospital. So they went from 22 and a half days to 6 days with using this approach. And the eat, sleep, console approach is not really any different than, how you would treat a normal infant. Is just making sure they're, getting fed regularly, that they're at least getting an ounce, that they're sleeping undisturbed for at least an hour, and that they can be consoled within 10 minutes. In their research, they found that this approach is intuitive, it's easily understood, and they were able to reduce the withdrawal syndromes without additional opiates. So, fewer infants needed that pharmacological treatment to ease and get rid of those withdrawal syndromes. One of the resources that I mentioned earlier was the link that I provided on the back of the brochure. And what that link takes caregivers to is a site that basically educates them on neonatal abstinence syndrome symptoms. So it goes over the signs and symptoms, it goes over what they are, and then what they can do to console their baby. And an example of that was if your child was suffering from myoclonic jerks, it describes it as babies experiencing withdrawals can have very sensitive central nervous systems, which can be easily stimulated by sound or touch. And so then it provides the parents, with what they can do if their baby was suffering from myoclonic jerks, and they suggest that they approach your baby quietly. You do not wake your baby up unless it's time to eat, and then you speak softly to your baby and use a firm touch. Do not stroke or pat your baby. So this site goes through many signs and symptoms and gives them kind of a, step-by-step process on what they can do to comfort their baby. Now, as far as the brochure goes itself, the design choice, I chose, colorful, because I am currently pregnant, and the wall of brochures that they have at the office is very one color, boring, doesn't really stick out to you. So I decided to make mine a little bit colorful, so that way if a person were to see this, they would be more likely to pick it up and read it just because of the design. It's also easy to follow, it's easy to read, and it offers additional resources, for further education, which I think is important if they wanted to further educate themselves on how to comfort their baby. The places that I would put this brochure in order to receive maximum impact would be hospitals, doctor's office, and then the health department. In the hospital, I think if the nurse and doctors are aware that the baby is suffering this, they should give you this brochure to take home with you. And then doctor's office, when you take your baby in for checkups and stuff, like I mentioned before, they have the wall of all those brochures, and this could be one on there that they could pick up and read. And then I also said the health department because I know for people who are on WIC and government assistance have to take their babies there sometimes for checkups and shots and things like that. And so having that brochure there would also impact a lot of people, and they could be able to, take it home and educate themselves and be able to comfort and soothe their baby. And one thing that I did want to point out is, the neonatal abstinence syndrome is something that can stay with the child throughout life. And so it's important that caregivers know that even though they're out of infancy, they should never stop, supporting or intervening if need be, and getting that child the extra help that they need.